I'm Sofia Xeniadi, and I'm very excited to kick off a full day of learning and sharing and connecting with you. We're proud to be hosting this year's event here at the Megaron, the Athens Concert Hall, with over 900 attendees joining us from Greece and beyond, which is honestly very amazing to see. Whether you are in QA, UX, development, or just curious about the space, today is all about sharing knowledge and growing together. So let's get started with our first session. Our first speaker, Dalia El-Shimy, will take us into the challenge of measuring creativity. So please give a warm welcome to Dalia to the stage.
Hey everyone, my name is Dalia. I lead the UX research team at WISE. And like many people who do UX research for a living, especially if you've been doing this for a long time, I too fell ass backwards into a research career. And I'm going to tell you the story of how that happened. And it might seem like I am going on a super self-indulgent tangent, but I promise it's eventually all going to make sense. Some of you might recognize this man. His name is Tony Wilson. And Tony Wilson is probably most famous for being one of the co-founders of Factory Records, which was a pretty legendary record label in Manchester that signed artists like Joy Division and New Order in the late 70s and probably helped make Manchester the epicenter of everything cool that was going on in the universe at that time. Tony Wilson was also my personal hero. See, he founded a record label not to make money, but to champion artists and music that he truly believed in. In fact, when Tony Wilson was dying in cancer, sadly, in 2007, after not being able to afford the treatment that he needed, he said that he had lived his life choosing to make history rather than make money. And you might think, based on that quote, that he would have regretted some of his choices, but the next thing he said after that was, "I've never paid for private health care because I'm a socialist," and that is another reason why he's one of my heroes. Now, growing up, I wanted to be Tony Wilson. I was obsessed with music, but I could not for the life of me play any instruments. I couldn't learn how to play instruments. It was like my brain was just not wired for it. But I still loved listening to music. I loved going to concerts. I loved discovering new artists, and I loved singing badly and loudly all of the time. And so I was convinced growing up that I was going to do something music-related with my life, even though, again, I couldn't play anything, but that's where my obsession with Tony Wilson came in. So I figured if I couldn't play an instrument, maybe I would do something like get into sound production or audio engineering, or maybe I would start my own record label, or maybe I would become an A&R man and just spend my days going to different concerts and finding out about cool new artists and then giving them all of my money. But there was a big wrinkle in my plans because I was also a huge nerd. I was good at math and science, and I was also the daughter of Egyptian parents who had immigrated to Canada when I was really young. And even though my parents kept telling me that I could do whatever I wanted with my life when I grew up, I feel like when you are an immigrant kid who happens to be good at math and science, you get a very specific path laid out in front of you, and it's a path where you're trying to make all of your parents' sacrifices worthwhile. And so no matter how hard I tried to follow the music thing, I felt like I was constantly being nudged back towards the math and science thing by my teachers and my counselors, and sometimes by the universe as a whole. For example, when I was in my last year of high school, I signed up to do a work placement for a semester, and there was a list of companies that I could choose from to do this work placement. And one of them was at a radio station, so obviously that was the one that I wanted. But my counselor, and her name was Grace Kelly, that's a true story, so Miss Kelly said that I should do a placement at a different company, at a space robotics company, because she said I could work at a radio station anytime, but being able to work on space stuff was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And she wasn't necessarily wrong. I got to work on the Canadarm, which is Canada's contribution to the International Space Station. I guess that was a pretty cool thing for a high schooler to do, but still, the music thing kept calling out to me. So when I applied to go to university, I decided to find a workaround. I was going to keep doing the math and science thing because, again, that was the sensible thing for an immigrant kid who was good at math and science to do. But I chose to study math and electrical engineering specifically because in my not yet fully formed 17-year-old brain, it seemed like a way of getting at something audio or music related. So, there are circuits inside electric guitars, and electronic music instruments are a thing, and math is really the bedrock of digital signal processing, which is the bedrock of music production and audio engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So it seemed like it made sense to me at the time. And this campus that looks like Hogwarts is where I went to university, but I actually spent my days in the basement of this really ugly building, which was the math building. And so to make my miserable life slightly more bearable, I started volunteering at the campus and community radio station, which ended up being a bit of a haven for me. And I spent 4 years studying math and engineering, and I was still getting nowhere closer to knowing anything professional about music, or about math and engineering for that matter. And so when I was almost done school, I decided to do the only sensible thing that an immigrant kid who's good at math and science would do, and I started applying for grad school to study more math and engineering, as if that was somehow magically going to change things for me. But somehow, around that time, something did actually change. So as I was applying for all these master's and PhD programs, I was hanging out at the campus radio station one night, and I was sitting next to another DJ, and he was a few years older than me. He was a grad student himself, and he asked me why I looked so miserable. And I started telling him about my disappointing life prospects, and he told me that he had a friend who was in an engineering grad program at McGill University in Montreal, and that his friend, even though he was an engineer, was doing research in something called music technology, which was all about building and engineering all kinds of crazy musical instruments and environments for musicians to play around with. So of course, I was completely blown away that there was even such a thing. So I applied for the program, I got accepted, and the following year, I started in the lab of a professor who was officially in the electrical engineering department, but he was also part of a music technology multidisciplinary group. And he had all these grad students in his lab who were working on really cool music-related projects. And my supervisor slash PhD, my professor slash PhD supervisor told me that it was mandatory for everyone who he was supervising to take this course that he teaches. And I was like, okay, sure, what's the course? And he said it's called Human-Computer Interaction. And I had no idea what the hell that was. But at that point in history specifically, it was a bunch of researchers who were trying to recreate the interface from Minority Report. And I was like, okay, whatever, that looks cool, so let's go. So I took his course, and at first I found it painful. I did not understand why I had to care about users or humans, because keep in mind, at that point, I'm still a math and science nerd, I'm studying engineering, and this here is my idea of what an interface looks like. I was programming in a language called Pure Data, which some of you might have come across, but it's basically an open source version of another software called Max MSP, and you build these interfaces that are essentially completely incomprehensible to anyone except for the person who made them. And I didn't understand what the problem with that was. It seemed perfectly logical to me. But I'm taking this human-computer interaction course, and my professor is literally asking me to rewire my brain and care about humans and users, and I'm really not into it at first, but I don't really have a choice because my professor keeps saying that I have to do it. So around that same time, I started doing research on my own PhD project, and I had this idea for reasons that I will spare you because it's probably a whole other talk, but what I wanted to build was a performance environment that would allow musicians who were located in different parts of the world to be able to perform with each other over an internet connection. And ironically enough, this is like way pre-COVID, pre-remote everything, but it was kind of an active area of research at the time that I was really interested in. So I started working on it. And then it hits me really quickly that I have no clue what I'm doing. Because keep in mind, again, I am not a musician. I literally don't know how to play any instruments. I have no idea why musicians do what they do when they're jamming together. Now, at this point, some of you might start to see where the story is going, but I think to myself, hey, maybe this HCI thing could come in handy as I'm working on my project. So apparently, if I want to build something for people who are different from me, a user-centered design is something that could help me do that. And there was this paper written in 1985 by Golden Lewis, which I would argue is the genesis for a lot of the stuff that we do today. And what Golden Lewis say is that it's pretty simple. I just need to involve my users early on, learn about their needs and their challenges, and then build a solution, and then iteratively and empirically test and measure how well their solution actually meets their needs and solves their problems. So it seemed pretty straightforward. All I have to do is apply this exact framework, but just do it with musicians. I start doing that, and the whole thing falls apart really quickly. And let me tell you why. So say I take a classic framework for user-centered design, and I try to apply it to building the world's most optimal version of a calculator. So conventional wisdom and the conventional frameworks would say that I would start by trying to understand what my users' goals are when using a calculator, and then I would explore what problems they experience when they are using calculators as they exist today. And then I would explore solutions to alleviate those problems, and then I would test those solutions. And in order to test those solutions, I would give my users tasks. Those tasks would most likely be calculations that they need to carry out using this calculator. And then I would go about measuring things like how long it takes them to carry out those calculations, how many errors they make along the way, the success rate in getting the calculations right, how easily they can learn to use this new calculator, and maybe even overall how satisfied they are with the calculator that I've built. And I might even compare everything that I'm measuring with this new calculator to how they would do it on a traditional calculator, and I would repeat the process until I have the world's most amazing calculator, and I put it out in the world, and I just start to watch the money roll in. Now suppose I try to do this exact same thing, but to build something for musicians instead. So now what? I'm supposed to give them a task, but what exactly is a task in this context? Do I measure how long it takes them to complete something? But what is that? Playing a note, playing a song? I record how many errors they make, but what's an error in this context? Is it playing the wrong note? Is it getting the timing wrong? And I measure their success, but their success at doing what exactly? And suppose that I manage to figure all of that out, what exactly would I be comparing it to if the very thing I'm designing is a novel environment, which by definition they have no frame of reference for and nothing to compare it to? So at that point, I am once again completely stuck. Keep in mind, I'm still a math and science nerd in an engineering department, and I may be studying human-computer interaction, and I may be trying to apply user-centered design techniques to what I'm building, but this is circa 2010. Shit is still super quantitative everywhere, and everyone keeps asking you to prove that whatever it is that you're building and any experiments that you're running are quantitative and statistically significant, or they're not going to publish your paper. And if you followed the Chi journals over the years, for example, you probably have a sense of what I'm talking about. So here I am, literally trying to run experiments on musicians, and I'm tracking how they're moving, and I'm tracking what they're doing, and I'm swimming in data analytics, but all of it is meaningless because I don't even know what I'm looking for, because I don't even know what I'm trying to achieve, and I don't have a sense of what the problem that I'm trying to solve is, except trying to build something cool and maybe living out my dream of becoming Tony Wilson. So I am deep in PhD existential crisis mode at this point, which I now know is actually a very important and inescapable and integral part of doing a PhD, but back then I'm obviously freaking out. And so one day I am complaining to some other friends who are doing their PhDs and also going through their existential crises, except they're doing it in social science related fields. And I tell them about my problems, and someone says, "Have you thought about qualitative techniques?" And I was like, I have never heard of that. What is qualitative techniques? So I literally march myself across campus in the middle of a lovely Montreal winter, and I set foot for the first time ever in the Humanities and Social Sciences Library. And I take out a book on qualitative research, and I'm pretty sure it was literally called Qualitative Research. And I start to read this book, and my brain completely melts. All of a sudden I realize that it's not all just about running experiments and quantitative measurements and doing usability testing. And it says that I can talk to people and then analyze that and then use that to understand what's actually important to them instead of just making shit up as I go along and deciding on their behalf. And all that was completely novel to me. So I tried it out. I ran some open-ended interviews with the types of musicians that I'm trying to build my performance environment for. And I learned that what they actually care about is not necessarily usability, but things like having fun and creativity and self-expression, and even the ability to just interact with each other. And that if I want to have any chance in hell for them to use the system that I'm building, then I'm going to have to give them a stronger sense of all of those things that they do from playing music in the traditional way. Seemed awesome. I felt like I had a sense of direction. But then immediately I was like, how the hell do you measure fun and creativity and self-expression and social interaction? Because traditional HCI didn't have the answers. In fact, around that time, questions around how you measure things beyond usability were just starting to be asked by the HCI community for the first time. So it was only in 2007, for example, that people like Joe Fishkay, who's a pretty renowned HCI scientist, was starting to question the status quo of usability. And he was asking questions like, what if technology, not for accomplishing tasks, but for having experiences, for expressing one's identity, for flirting and arguing and living? And this quote comes from a paper called Evaluating Experience-Focused HCI. Notice that he's using the word experience and not usability. It was one of the first times that that term was starting to make the rounds in HCI, and I'll let you draw your own conclusion about how that's related to UX as we know it today. Now, Joe Fishkay was asking how we measure things that up until that point, we didn't have mechanisms for measuring according to the HCI literature. But that was exactly what I had to figure out, because I wasn't necessarily shipping a product per se, and I wasn't necessarily accountable to a CEO, but I knew that one day I was going to have to defend the work that I was doing to a panel of engineering professors who were going to scrutinize every aspect of my approach and who were going to ask me how rigorous and accurate and repeatable my techniques was, and who were going to grill me on statistical significance. So because of that, I knew that no matter how I went about measuring those things that musicians told me were important to them, things like creativity or self-expression, I was going to need to make sure that my methods still upheld the rigor and the reliability that we expect from traditional research and measurement techniques. And I also knew that none of this was going to be a straightforward engineering project, and it was probably going to require a mixture of science and art and understanding and ingenuity. And after literally years of exploration and trial and error, there's a few things that I learned along the way. First of all, there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to research and evaluation. And so when your usual techniques aren't going to work, you're going to need to step outside your box. And in order to do that correctly, you're going to have to first understand the rules so that you can figure out exactly where and how you're allowed to break them without losing any rigor. And a big part of doing that is going to be about re-examining and re-evaluating the user's role in your process. And finally, doing all the above, steps 1 through 4, is nothing more than a process of repeated experimentation, analysis, learning, and iteration. And maybe it seems kind of straightforward, but let's break down what each of those actually mean and how I arrived at it. First of all, accepting that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So I personally find it completely wild that the entire field of user research sometimes gets boiled down in tech parlance, or particularly in PM parlance, to talking to customers. I'm not even going to get into the difference between conducting actual interviews and just talking to customers, but even the most comprehensive, in-depth, rigorous user interviews are not necessarily going to uncover everything that you need to learn. And that really shouldn't surprise any of us who spent any time doing research. There's so much more than interviews. We can talk about methods as being design-led versus research-led, or expert versus participatory. We could even slice them down as behavioral versus attitudinal, or quantitative versus qualitative. And that's without even getting into what mixing any of those methods together is going to give you. So sure, for me, doing the in-depth interviews with the musicians was a really critical first step to understand what they needed, but once I had uncovered what they cared about, I was again stuck, because doing traditional user-centered design told me how to optimize for usability, but it didn't tell me to optimize for the things that the musicians told me that they needed and cared about, like again, self-expression and creativity. So I had to first accept that even though the theory presents as if it's linear and as if it's a one-size-fits-all approach, the reality, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, is actually very different. So I realized that I had to go outside of what traditional HCI and user-centered design and engineering books and papers and frameworks told me I needed to do. And I started asking myself, who else knows about measuring things like happiness and enjoyment? And that's when I came across this happy-looking guy. This is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. You might also know him as the man who coined and defined the concept of flow, which can be seen as a proxy for enjoyment. And so while enjoyment itself might be too intangible or ill-defined to measure, flow actually isn't. And there was already a lot of established techniques for how to measure flow. And you know who cares not only about flow, but also about immersion and social interaction? Game designers. I found out that there was an entire field of research that was devoted to understanding humans and games called ludology. And within ludology, they had all kinds of established, vetted techniques and questionnaires to measure things that my musicians cared about. And did you know that there are people who've made an entire career based entirely on studying creativity and how to measure creativity? So Linda Candy, for example, was someone whose work I kept coming across, and she was particularly interested in how we define creativity so that by extension we could be able to measure creativity. Now, nobody in my engineering department knew about any of this. No one told me about any of this. I had to step out of what people around me were doing in order to understand what adjacent fields were thinking about. But, of course, this wasn't just a matter of copying and pasting. I couldn't, for example, take a questionnaire that was designed to assess the experience of video gamers and then just blindly give it to musicians and hope for the best. I knew I was going to have to adapt things, but I also knew that I was going to have to adapt in a way that didn't break all the rigor that made those techniques that I was trying to borrow vetted and accepted in the first place. And so to do this, I needed to understand the rules that underpin the rigor of these techniques so that I could understand exactly where and how I can modify them without losing any of that rigor. And I actually often compare this challenge to fashion. So some people like to be really creative when it comes to their style. They want to be seen as unique and as having a sense of fashion that's entirely their own. And you can try doing that by throwing on whatever you feel like willy-nilly. But if you don't know what you're doing, chances are you're probably going to look like an idiot. The people who actually do this really well aren't throwing on clothes randomly. They have a pretty solid understanding of the traditional rules of fashion and aesthetics in general. They understand which colors go together, they understand which patterns match, which patterns clash, they understand which silhouettes and shapes are complementary to each other, and they understand where the point of no return into ridiculousness is. And it's by knowing all this that they know exactly when to push things just the right amount so that it leads to something a little unexpected, but also somehow cohesive. And you can probably apply the same thinking to art or music or movies or food or design or pretty much any field where norms and people who want to break those norms have to coexist. But if you don't understand the fundamental rules that you are trying to adapt or to bend, you're probably going to veer into some nonsense. And I would say that this applies to science just as much as it applies to art. So if you truly want to adapt some in-depth interviews or usability testing or longitudinal study or surveying techniques, for the love of everything that is good in the universe, please take the time to understand why those techniques were established in the first place and how. And please do this even if you've been doing it the usual way for a long time. Because as soon as you start modifying a technique and you don't understand the rigor behind it and why you were allowed to do it, you're going to be on really shaky grounds. Two books that I recommend that are a great reference for this and really get into the background of why the methods that we use and take for granted every day are things we can use and take for granted every day are Observing the User Experience for Qualitative Research and Measuring the User Experience for Quantitative Research. As you take your time to dive into the very things that make the techniques that we take for granted as rigorous as they are in the first place, you will probably at some point have to reflect on the role that your users play in your design and evaluation process. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So some of the most common techniques that we're used to, like interviews or usability tests or surveys, are actually like a one-way mirror. So they are one-sided interaction with your users. You recruit them, you get their input, you give them some sort of compensation for their time, and you send them on their merry way, probably don't interact with them again. And again, this works really well when you are building traditional systems with utilitarian applications, but going back to what I was trying to do when I was building something for musicians, I did start out with the interviews, which were one-sided interactions, and I very quickly ran into the wall because there was only so much that these types of one-sided interactions were actually teaching me about how the musicians behaved and what they needed and expected. And so I started exploring more in-depth ways to bring the musicians into my design process, and that's when I came across participatory design. Now, many of you may have done workshops with your users over the years. You probably refer to those as co-design or co-creation sessions or workshops. But did you know that this actually comes from a long and well-established practice that originated in Scandinavia in the 60s, completely outside the realm of tech and digital design? And the idea behind participatory design is it's not supposed to be just a one-off workshop or a one-off co-creation sessions with your users. It's an ongoing design process where your users essentially become part of your team. They're not just providing input, they are part of your discussions, they are making decisions with you, and the idea is they have a vested interest in the eventual outcome just as much as you do. And so I brought on a band. We worked together on a weekly basis. They would come into the lab, they would jam using the system that I was building, and then afterwards we would sit around and we would have discussions, and we would decide together what I needed to change about that performance environment before they came back the following week for their next jam session. But of course, anytime you are experimenting with ways to bring users more deeply and more meaningfully into your design process, you have to take a step back and you have to look at things like power dynamics between the users and the designers or researchers. You have to think about skill gaps. You have to think about differences in communication style and essentially how to level the playing field between everybody who's participating in the process so that they can have equal input. And to solve from these challenges, a book that I highly recommend is called Convivial Toolbox. In it, you're going to find all kinds of activities and toolkits and ways to break down the walls between designers and researchers and users so that you can level the playing field and, again, have a more meaningful collaboration. Finally, just like everything else we build in life, the path to getting there is experimentation, analysis, learning, and iteration. Now, I started by saying that there is truly no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to research and evaluation and design, especially if you are trying to build something outside of the realm of the utilitarian or practical. So probably the first thing you're going to try is not going to magically stick. And I would say that that's okay. I would say that maybe it's even by design. But even then, even if you know that going in, nobody really wants to feel like they're just throwing spaghetti at the wall. I think it's okay to experiment. It's good to experiment so long as you have a way of determining whether each successive experiment brings you closer to the goal that you're trying to achieve. Which essentially means that as you are trying out new evaluation techniques, you are going to want to evaluate whether those evaluations are actually working. I know that sounds like a lot of nonsense, and there are some really weird texts about this out there, and I mean really, really weird texts, but I will spare you the pain of having to read some of these papers. And I will say that if you strip everything down to the fundamentals, there's just a few questions that you really need to ask yourself and reflect on every time you're trying a new way of doing research or measurement or evaluation. First of all, would you be able to replicate the same technique again? Or was it creative to the point of being completely ephemeral or something that can't be replicated? Because if so, that's probably a bad sign. The very foundation of all research is that it should be repeatable. This is why we talk about things like statistical significance and error margins and confidence levels. You need to be able to prove that if you were to do the exact same thing again in the exact same way, you are going to end up with comparable results. So as you're trying something new, think about what would happen if you tried to run it all over again. And better yet, if you have the luxury of trying it out again, which is probably a good idea if you're playing around with a technique for the very first time, try to repeat it and see what happens. Next, did your technique break along the way? Did you, for example, design a diary study, but you ended up with very few entries? Or maybe you tried to interview your users about something that they had no idea how to talk about? Or maybe you tried to facilitate a workshop or a co-design session where everyone was too confused to participate in the activities you designed. I actually love it when this happens. I know it can seem really demoralizing in the moment, but if you ask me, anytime that a research technique breaks, it's because it was built on an assumption that didn't turn out to be true. So for example, if you design a diary study and you get very few entries, it might be an indication that the thing you thought people were doing on a regular basis is not something they're doing on a regular basis. And I think that those can be really significant insights in and of themselves. So if that happens to you, go back and re-examine the things that you thought were true in the first place when you designed that research technique. And then finally, with every successive iteration, with every technique that you adapt and try out, ask yourself whether you got closer to learning what you needed. Was it worthwhile in the end, or do you have to try something else to get you closer to the insights that you need in order to move forward? Now, going back to my super self-indulgent life story, after doing this stuff for a really long time and playing around with research and measurement and adapting techniques, I did eventually find a way to measure creativity and self-expression and enjoyment and social interaction. And I did in the end manage to build a system that the musicians could not only figure out how to use, but actually enjoyed using compared to performing in the traditional way. And I did manage to convince a panel of engineering professors to give me my degree. This is me here right after my defense. But you know, the real reason they gave me my PhD wasn't because of the thing that I built. And the reason they gave it to me also wasn't because I was able to demonstrate that you can measure things like creativity or self-expression. The real contribution that I had was all of the bits around how you do research when you run up against the boundaries of traditional research and evaluation. So my contribution was those things in and of themselves. Now, I did this research way back between 2007 and 2014, and I would say, not to date myself, but I don't mind, I'm 40 years old, so I'm not young. But it seems like revisiting all of this stuff in 2026 without talking about AI feels like we are deliberately avoiding the elephant in the room. I'd like to get away with not talking about it, but I feel like I must. So I went back and re-examined how all of those lessons that I learned back then apply into today's seemingly very different world. Now, that's not to say that AI wasn't the thing back then. It was definitely a thing. AI has been around way longer than when ChatGPT made everything explode at the end of 2022. In fact, my PhD supervisor, who, as I mentioned, was teaching the human-computer interaction course at McGill, also taught the artificial intelligence course. And I audited his course, but things back then looked very different than what they do today. Back then, we used to talk about neural networks and machine learning, and it was a lot more about predictive AI than the generative AI that we know today. So needless to say, back then it wasn't something that I really had to think about in the context of my own research, but again, things look different today and I feel like it's worthwhile examining. And that's not because as a researcher I'm just embracing AI with blind enthusiasm, but I've been doing this research thing long enough to recognize that even though the fundamentals of good research don't change, the way that we practice research can evolve. So to me, I see AI as a tool. Tools come and go. They always have, and they will continue to do so. But tools can also revolutionize how we carry out the tasks that are part of our practice. And simply, it's our responsibility to keep up with how to do that. So that's the lens I apply when I think about how generative AI as a tool has impacted these fundamental lessons that I learned throughout my career. It hasn't changed the lessons, but it's kind of added new layers and new considerations that I think about. So let me show you what I mean. The first lesson that I shared is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to doing research. Now, one of the main applications I see of AI today, this is something that my team does all of the time, is people doing what I call templatizing their research. So they're taking artifacts like research plans they've written in the past, discussion guides, findings reports, and they're training AI on these previous artifacts so that it can generate new versions for different contexts on an ongoing basis. Now, that is, of course, a great way to speed up some tasks that can seem very repeatable, but it also makes it really tempting to apply the same template every time you're looking at a new study, because when you have a hammer, everything can look like a nail. And of course, this is exactly opposite of the no one-size-fits-all approach that I've been talking about. So what can you do about this? First of all, don't assume that every type of research you do can or even should be templatized in the first place. If you see repeatable patterns across your work, of course, it's worth examining that and looking at whether you can abstract and pull out something that can be replicated in the future for the sake of efficiency. But I think it's just as important to embrace the idiosyncrasies. It's important to embrace the one-offs. It's important to embrace the situations where your template doesn't work, not as something that's time-consuming, but as an opportunity to truly go outside the bounds of your norms and try and learn something new. And so how can you tell the difference between when to use a template versus when to try something new or not use your template? I would say this is really where you see the difference between a tool and a skill. So the tool here is AI, but the skill is knowing how to match the method to the question you're trying to answer, and that's always been a fundamental skill in our profession. So training AI to replicate your past process is an example of how to use a tool for efficiency. Knowing when to use a method that you've tried over and over versus trying something new is the skill you need to develop in order to make the most of the tool. The second lesson was that once you've decided that your usual method is not necessarily going to apply well to a given situation, you need to explore something new and step outside your box. Now, AI can again come in handy here. When I was doing my research way back in the day, the only way in which I could find academic knowledge outside of my engineering field was to literally walk over to another department's library, or to talk to people outside of my field, or to go to non-engineering conferences. And now all of that knowledge is arguably at your fingertips if you just know what to look for. And you can definitely ask AI to help you find problem domains that are connected or related to the one you're trying to understand, but be very aware, I'm sure many of you have had firsthand experience with that, is that AI has a hard time saying no. If you ask it to draw a connection between two things and the connection doesn't exist, it's not going to tell you that the connection doesn't exist. It will try to force it. But it's probably a good thing that we know how to do research, we know how to check sources, we know how to ask for citations, we know how to ask open and neutral and non-biased questions, and all of these things are things that can also help you mitigate the risk of AI making nonsense when you are writing up your prompts. And if AI suggests that you apply a particular method that you've never done before, and it tells you how to do it, don't just apply it blindly and move on. This is the exact same frustration that we've had over the years when people with very little research experience confidently say, oh, I ran some interviews or I sent a survey. We know that the insights that are going to come out of their activity are going to be surface level at best, because we know that their knowledge of the techniques is surface level at best. So don't be that person. Don't follow the AI recipe blindly. Take the time to go deeper and understand the foundations of that method and what makes it rigorous in the first place, and the gotchas and pitfalls that come with it. Because it's only with that level of understanding that you'll understand how you're allowed to adjust the rules. So since, again, generative AI came into our lives and we started outsourcing part of our work to it, we've been talking about the importance of having a human in the loop. I would argue that you don't just need a human in the loop, you need an expert in the loop. You need to be able to call AI out on its shit when it gives you stuff that doesn't make any sense, and it's required more than people actually realize. And the model's getting better and better doesn't actually decrease this need for expertise, it actually amplifies it. Because as the knowledge that the models produce gets more and more sophisticated, as it gets more complex, as it gets more sophisticated than what a normal person with a normal amount of knowledge about any given topic can verify, you're going to need expertise to be able to do that. So we say AI is not going to replace the need for human judgment, but you can't provide judgment if you haven't built expertise and understanding in the first place. I started out years ago by saying that you needed to understand the rules in order to see where you can bend them, and I would say that nowadays that exact same knowledge is exactly what you need in order to provide the critical judgment on what AI puts out. And as you develop more expertise in different kinds of research techniques, you'll start to realize that there are still many different ways to involve your users in your process. Now, this idea, I would say, has never been more important than in an age where people talk with zero irony about things like synthetic users and AI moderated research session. And I'm not going to outright dismiss those things, to be honest. I think there is a place and a time for applying these techniques, but I also will say that using them is not a substitute for connecting with the real humans that we are building experiences for. In fact, if we are going to go down the route of AI doing research on our behalf or speaking on behalf of our users, I think it becomes even more critical to identify how to balance that with where and how deeply you need to bring real human users into your design and product development process. Finally, remember that if you are going to rebel against a one-size-fits-all approach to research, if you're going to step outside your box, if you are going to bend the rules, if you are going to reevaluate where and how to involve your users in your design process, then you have to keep experimenting, learning, and iterating. This is the only way that your process is going to get better over time. Now, one of my favorite things about AI is that it engenders what I call a generative mindset, meaning that it enables people to generate more ideas more quickly than ever before. And that means that by its very nature, by default, it is pushing us to experiment and to learn and to iterate more quickly than before. But we can't just experiment into oblivion without knowing what we're working towards. So playing around with AI tools, doing AI prototyping, doing vibe coding is fun, but it needs direction at the end of the day. And playing around with the research techniques that you need to try out to support these new ways of building product is also fun, but it also needs direction. So know what you're working towards, define what success means, and I don't mean success just in terms of the product or the experiences that you're building, but also success in terms of whether your approach to evaluating that product or experience is giving you the right insights that you need in order to keep moving forward. We already know that it's important to measure, to learn, to iterate. It's very much the foundation of research, and we know that it's because we can't improve what we can't measure. But what I'm saying here is that we need to be more intentional about what it is that we measure, especially in a world where AI literally can make any idea that pops into your head come to life. Things like usability are going to become just table stakes. Usability is what your users expect as a baseline, but it's not what's going to differentiate what you build as being different or being a cut above beyond the rest. This journey that I've been on for God knows how many years now started when I realized I had to measure things like creativity and self-expression and enjoyment and social interaction because that's what was important to my users. Usability was of course important to them, but it was never going to be enough. It was never going to be a determinant in whether the thing I was building was something that they were actually going to want to use for themselves. Now, some of you might be thinking, I don't know how this applies to me. You might think that measuring creativity or self-expression sounds kind of fun or cool or maybe boring, I don't know. But maybe you just build apps or products that are meant to help people complete task A or get from B to C. But I would bet that if you take a moment and really examine things more closely, you're probably building a lot more than that. So I work at Wise, for example. I contribute to building an app that on the surface makes it easier for people to send and receive and hold and invest money. And yes, money can be thought of as the most transactional, the most utilitarian, the most practical application of all, but money is also emotional. Money is taboo, money is aspirational, money can be stressful, money can be shameful, money can be delightful. And so in what world can I claim that the thing I build is something that's purely transactional or utilitarian? And the experiences all of us build may exist to help people complete specific tasks, but they probably are also going to elicit emotional reactions, whether that's by design or not. And there's a very good chance that even if they're just designed to help people complete specific tasks, they probably also help people live their lives and be creative and be expressive and connect with each other. And I think it's our duty to understand how what we build contributes to all of that in a broader sense. Now, I want to close by saying that there is so much emphasis these days on product. Every company is a product-led company, and we're all product first, and we are called product designers now and product researchers, and there's so much discussion on how AI can help us build product faster and ship more of it more quickly. And you know what? Actually, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. We live in a capitalist society. Product is how our businesses make money so that we can make money, so that we can live our best lives. But I would also say that it's probably more important than ever to remember that at the end of the day, we are still building experiences for humans. Even if you're building agentic experiences, those agents are probably at the end of the day still trying to solve problems for actual humans. And I think that the companies that are going to differentiate themselves aren't going to do so on the basis of usability alone, because that's just something that's expected. And they're not going to do it just on the basis of speed alone, because that's essentially a race to the bottom. They're going to do so based on how they develop a more deeper understanding of what their users actually need and what matters to them beyond just making something usable. So with that, I hope all of you go forth and build something awesome for other humans. Thank you.
Sorry, that was very insightful, and thank you very much for your talk. I loved your position on both AI and research. Do you have any questions? We have microphones on both sides, so... Yes? I heard the yes up there.
Hi.
Hi. Okay.
Thank you very much for your speech, for the lecture. And you're talking about going beyond the usability. So if you can tell us a bit more about how you do that practically in your organization,
Yeah.
when it comes to talking with people who make decisions about a product. How do you make them talk and speak about other dimensions of their product beside from the usability or completing a certain tasks?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's first helping them understand that usability, as I mentioned, a baseline. It's something, it's a table stakes. If you don't have it, people aren't going to even interact with your product. So we all agree that usability is something that we need to care about. But then it comes to saying, what else on top of that can make the product better? What else can speak more to people's experiences, which we know is going to increase the likelihood of them actually using it? Doing open-ended interviews or kind of more exploratory techniques to understand what's important to people can give you an evidence-based way to talk back to those decision makers and say, we now understand those other things that are important for our users. And you can also make the argument that addressing the things that are important to them is going to increase the likelihood that they actually use your product. And so it essentially can be boiled down to a discussion of how do we make the product or the business most successful. I get asked all the time questions like, can you do research to find out if people would use this thing? And we know from foundational research that that's not really a reliable technique, because if you ask someone, would you use something, out of politeness or the fact that it costs them nothing, they'll say, yeah, sure, I'll use it, because there's no detriment to giving that answer. How I try to reframe that question is by saying the best likelihood of people using a thing that you build is by making sure that it actually solves a problem that they have and that it actually addresses some need that they have. So you can, again, break it down to like, okay, if we want people to use the thing, it needs to speak to things that are important to them, understand the things that are important to them, and then iteratively try to prove or test whether this thing is actually meeting the needs that they have. And that's how you're able to bring things beyond usability into the equation and into the conversation.
So if I understand well, this means that opening this field includes going into field-specific areas, or industry-specific?
I think it's dependent on what you uncover is important, right? So like you might uncover from talking to your users that the challenges that they have are maybe the products that they're using aren't meeting every single need that they have, or it needs more speed, or it needs more of something else. And when you understand what's important, you might have techniques that already exist and you're familiar with that help you measurement, but you also might not. And so what I'm concerned with is when you uncover something that you don't have ready-made techniques to be able to measure, what do you do then? And this is where going outside of your field and seeing how it's done elsewhere can be really powerful.
Thank you very much.
And we have another question here, the gentleman.
Thank you. That was an awesome talk. In fact, it was like 3 talks in one, so yeah, great. And it was towards the end that you really, I got really curious about what you were talking about, the emotional and all the other antecedents, the other sides to money in the work you do. And I'm really curious about what framework you use to measure those as part of your research work.
So one of the things, it's a good question. We don't have frameworks that we're like, this is the exact framework we use every time, but we try, based on the line of inquiry that we're doing, to try and adapt how we ask about a particular thing. So for example, at WISE, something that we talk about a lot is trust. How do people trust the app when they're using it to send money? Teams will talk about the concept of trust as a very high-level thing and assume that we all know exactly what it means and assume that it means the same thing to all of our users. But when we dig deeper and we start to talk to people about trust, we realize that trust can take on many different definitions, not only depending on the task that you're trying to do, but also depending on how familiar you are with the product. So building trust when you're using the app for the first time is not the same thing as building trust when you're worried about being scammed and you've used the app many, many different times. You can talk about trust from the perspective of, is the app secure and is my data secure and it won't be hacked, versus trust when it comes to, I trust that my money will arrive on time to the person I need to be sending it to. And so what we'll do in cases like that is really look at the context in which we're trying to understand the concept of trust, understand what trust means in that specific context, and then think about what are the best ways for us to measure or evaluate that. So you can see how by kind of honing in on the definition more, we can design tasks or surveys or questions that allow us to get at that specific definition. So this goes back again to not having like a one-size-fits-all approach, and not taking the terms that we think we all understand for granted, but really digging deeper into what does that mean for them, and then how do we design things that get closer to that definition of trust for those specific users in that specific context.
Fantastic, thank you.
Hello. Hi, Dalia. Thank you so much for being here today to share your experience. On the matter of measuring the experience of creatives and measuring creativity in general, have you managed to discover any particular constructs that are valid and reliable to measure either the process, their experience in a tangible way that would make sense?
So the way that I did it was, again, looking by a lot of what the literature said about what creativity is, which is, again, a really crazy thing to try and define. But there is some consensus that has been built around what the creative process looks like, the different steps that people go through as part of the creative process, the different things that people experience when they are having a creative process. And then I tried to take those and break them down into the most granular questions that I could, self-evaluated or self-reported question about every single dimension that I could possibly think of, drawn from those texts. So it wasn't just based off on the top of my head, this is what I think creativity is. It was like, these are the definitions, these are the things that people experience. So nowhere in my questionnaires or in my discussions with the musicians did I ever ask, did you feel creative when you were jamming today? But I asked about things like whether they felt that they had maybe experienced something that they hadn't experienced before, whether they had any ideas that they hadn't experienced before. I looked for emotional dimensions of what people experience when they're having creativity and tried to assess the extent to which they were experiencing those different things. So looking at it, you wouldn't have necessarily been able to pinpoint directly like, oh, she's asking me about creativity. But by having a breadth of questions and enough of them that get at all of these different facets, you can eventually get to a somewhat reliable outcome of it. And then, of course, like repeating that over and over, right? So it's not like I sent out a survey and then I just like saw what people said. When I did the participatory design with the musicians, it was mixing a bunch of different methods together. I was looking at how they were moving, I was looking at how they were playing, I was having the discussions with them, and I was asking them the same questions week after week about creativity and self-expression. So you triangulate all of that together and you start to have more of a fleshed out idea about what's happening over time.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It really struck a chord, pun intended. So as a follow-up to one of the previous questions from this side, do you think that there's a place in this industry, maybe like in more traditional sort of software or more corporate, I would say, to have testing sessions or feedback sessions with users purely based on emotional response to the software? Nothing to do with usability, nothing to do with anything measurable other than just asking users how they feel when they use the software?
Yeah, so I've done research in the past. I used to work at Shopify, and I spent many years working on the Shopify checkout, which is essentially where people part with their money to buy goods. And we did research over and over the years to try and understand the usability of the checkout, but eventually got to a point where we realized that what we were learning from doing traditional usability sessions was very limited because it wasn't coupled with intent. It wasn't real money that people were working with. It wasn't their own hard-earned money. It wasn't a real decision about something that they needed to buy. And so we and our stakeholders were aware that we can only correlate so much how this usability test was going to go to real-life conversion when people, when people were using their real money to make real purchases. So we decided that we needed to find a way to give people money that they would use on real purchases. And so we brought them in. We said that their compensation for participating in the test was money that they could spend on a store, so the stakes got a little bit more real. And we actually used different sensor to measure their emotional response and their stress levels as they were doing through that. And the findings that we got from that allowed us to understand a completely different dimension that we couldn't really simulate by just trying to understand usability. I mean, if you've shopped online, you know that going through a checkout that is easy to use is not going to be a determinant of you buying something you don't actually want. And we also know that if you want to buy something you really, really want, you will put up with a really shitty checkout just to get the thing that you want. So we knew that there was a dimension that was completely missing. So I think I wouldn't frame it as like it's usability versus emotion and one's good and one's bad. But if you are at a place where you are running up against bounds of what you're able to learn, if you feel like you're kind of hitting a wall and you're not, every successive iteration, every successive usability test is just becoming incremental at that point, but something is still missing, I think you can make a really good case for what else do we need to understand? How do we mimic the real life scenarios that people are going through? How do we make it more ecologically valid? I would say that the challenge is not so much to convince people to do this versus that when it comes to research. It's just having the buy-in, having like stakeholders who actually understand why it's important to understand the humans. And if they understand that, I think there is a way and there's a negotiation and there's a discussion that is about what's the best way that we can get that knowledge. If we believe the knowledge is important, then what's the best way for us to get that knowledge?
Thank you.
Dalia, thank you very much for your speech. I could not agree more about your statement that AI should be treated as a tool, like we used to treat the internet when it came in our lives. How do you think AI will affect the UX sector in the following years?
It's a big question. It's a good question. I actually spent last week doing a research sprint where we just like locked ourselves in a room for 4 days to try and understand what all of the studies and all of the examples and like all of the experts that we could get our hands on were saying about how AI is changing product development in particular, and then try to understand what that means for the practice of research. So I think that we've been thinking a lot about this in terms of looking at how we build product today and the traditional sort of like product development life cycle where it's like, okay, you have an idea and then you define it and then you discover and then you build and then you launch and then you measure and you iterate and maybe you sunset. And we've been looking at that process as it exists and then saying, okay, well, AI can make this part faster. AI tools can like make this part a little bit better. And I think that we're kind of looking at the end of the funnel, but instead what's actually happening is that AI is fundamentally changing how we build product. We're no longer operated. The process was never really linear. We pretended like it was linear, but what's actually happening now is the way in which people have ideas, implement those ideas, put them in the hands of users, that cycle is getting significantly shorter, and that has a lot of implication. The fact that it's kind of become more democratized, and it's not just a designer or an engineer who could do that, but many other people, has implications that come with it. The fact that we can arguably put anything in our user's hand has implications for it. So we tried to look at how that way of working is changing, the guardrails that we need to put around it in order to make sure that it's being done effectively, and then where research and design tasks need to be done differently to support this new way of working. And then we look at where the tools best fit in as part of that process. So instead of starting with the tools and being like, this is how I can use a tool throughout this traditional process, it's like the process is shifting. How do we work more effectively in this new process? And then what are the tools that are going to help us as we work in this process to kind of do it as effectively as possible? So I don't know what the future holds any more than any other person. I think we can try and look at like signals and try to extrapolate, but I think the thing I'm really interested in right now is how the process is shifting and how we shift to adapt to that process. And yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you very much. Very interesting journey.
I can't
stand.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I have a question about the research process. We rely entirely too much when we do research on having people describe what they feel, they have to do some introspection. And I, for once, in my experience, most of us are not articulate enough to even describe what they feel.
Yeah.
So we end up with data that is not really valid, and of course that leads to the wrong assumptions being made, the wrong insights being provided. So isn't it high time to actually evolve our own processes and how we actually measure for that?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer or a solution. But
I do. Because the thing is, like, those techniques have existed for a long time. They've just been buried because we just have defaulted so much to the idea that you just do usability evaluations. But like, I think it was Microsoft who had something called a desirability toolkit that they, published many, many years ago. And it is a toolkit that consists of images and words that allow people to express different things that they're feeling, and it's proven to be relatively reliable in helping people talk about different emotions that experiences elicit. The book that I talked about, Convivial Toolbox, is filled with techniques around how to use cultural probes and creative toolkits filled with like Legos and collages and ways of drawing as a way to kind of build an understanding with your users. So it's not all about just asking them about an experience, which we do know is unreliable because they're working off of memory, but rather getting them to use all kinds of other ways to express what's going on through their minds and how they're feeling. And I think that one of the most interesting things about AI right now with the idea of generative AI prototyping is, in the past, I've always talked about this idea of building artifacts, not building artifacts specifically for the purpose of research, building artifacts that embody kind of crazy ideas or different concepts and just putting them in front of your users as a way to elicit emotional reactions and have conversations rather than just pure interviews. And in the past, it was hard for us to do that because designer time was limited. You needed to find a designer or someone who would help you do that. But now you can generate the prototypes yourself. You can put those in front of your users. And again, they're not meant to be final prototypes or solutions. They're meant to be things that are that elicit emotional reactions by definition. So I had a researcher on my team the other day who built out, he works on the investing products that we have at Wise, which again can be a very like intense and emotional topic for a lot of people. And he built out these kind of polarizing and different experiences that don't look anything like our product, not because he was trying to get people to test them, but because he wanted to see how they reacted and what they said. And it became much richer than just asking them the question straight up. And again, that's something he wouldn't have been able to do a couple of years ago without input from a designer, but now is able to do. So I think it's going in some pretty interesting directions. And we're going kind of full circle with a lot of techniques that have existed for a long time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Our time is up, so thank you very much for the insightful talk, and thank you, everyone.